Hello, here we are again working on a geography of the Western world, and in particular we are now doing the Russian domain, mostly of course the country Russia. We have looked at some aspects of that, and today's aspect is extremes of the landscape. Let's take a look. Okay, then, Russia is huge. We've talked some about this. That means area. Russia is big. We've talked a lot about this, population, and often extreme in landscape features. I think that makes common sense, actually. Let's see. Well, first of all, how did Russia get to be this big, whether population or huge land area? I'd like you to watch this video and gain more understanding of how this happened. So I'm going to leave this on the screen for a moment here. So jot down this address, this web link for this YouTube video. Don't sweat the details. Yeah, there's a lot of details in this. I don't need you to know all the details. I'd like you to see patterns of expansion. Yeah, take a note of how Moscow plays a role in here. It's not always Moscow that is the center of things. And yeah, take note of key leaders along the way, whether it's Ivan the Terrible, they would say Ivan Grozny or Ivan the Terrible, or other leaders. Yeah, pick up an understanding of that. So I'm pausing here so that you can jot down this web link correctly. And of course, you can just freeze the video and then jot this down as well. And then stop the presentation here, watch the video, and come back. Do that. Hey, okay, you're back. So let's now take a look. Okay, so Russia is huge in area. Well, I think that means it's likely to have extreme features. We have looked at a number of countries so far. We've looked at some that are pretty small. Of course, the Netherlands is something we mentioned a lot and is a very small country. Do they have all sorts of extreme landscape features? No. How could that be? They're just a little place. Yeah, they're noteworthy for being, well, good part of it should be underwater, right? That's its key landscape feature. It doesn't have all sorts of other extremes. Be very strange for a small country to have that. Not at all strange for a huge country to have many extreme features. So here are my top 10. Number one, the coldest places outside of Antarctica. And the coldest is a little village called Omyansk, out there, way out there in Siberia. And when we do the Russian video worksheet, there will be more on this little place. Okay, but why is this place and why is Siberia often so extremely cold? Well, far north. That's just one simple fact. It is very far north. This can sometimes be intuitively problematic for Americans. Maybe less so now. Maybe more so during the Cold War. During the Cold War, you'd see posters and there'd be the United States and there'd be the Soviet Union, and they'd be lined up like this as key opponents in the Cold War. And I think maybe that gave people the idea that on the map, they were lined up like this. No, not so. United States, Soviet Union. On the map, by how far north they were, Soviet Union was mostly north, Russia mostly north of the United States. The good match for Russia is Canada. Well, of course, we know that Canada is generally colder than the United States. Yes, Russia, typically colder in the United States because of its far northerly position. Okay. Secondly, inland locations tend to be colder. Large bodies of water tend to moderate temperatures. They make the summers a little cooler. They make the winters a little warmer for places that are on coastline. Yes, Siberia has coastline, but it is on the Arctic Ocean, which makes it pretty cold there. But go inland from the Arctic Ocean, then it's often colder still because of the inland location. There's lots of Siberian lands that are far from coastlines. White surfaces. Well, of course, snow and ice present white surfaces. And white surfaces generally in life are reflective, are efficient at reflecting light, including sunlight. So when sunlight comes down and strikes on a white surface, there is generally a good amount of reflection off that white surface. Thus, that energy from the sunlight is not absorbed well at the surface. Instead, often hits the white surface and bounces off. Siberia has a lot of snowy and icy places, northerly weather patterns. Well, it combines. This reflectivity off the surface contributes to having colder surfaces, which then typically maintain its snow and ice longer, which means there'd be more reflection, which means more cold surfaces, which means snow and ice tend to stay. You see, it can just keep going like this. Additionally, when we have sunlight at far northerly locations, it's not coming straight down like sun does often at the equator. Sunlight is often coming at a low angle. That low angle makes it very easy to reflect off the surface as well. All right, so white surfaces and reflectivity contribute to these cold places. Now, some areas in Siberia are mountainous, and as you go up these mountains, of course, it gets colder too. Higher elevations tend to be colder. But some of the coldest spots, including Oymyansk, are found in valleys between mountain ranges. And in these valleys, cold air tends to sink and to stay in the same place. Yes, so these are some of the big reasons why Siberia is very cold. Yes, Oymyansk. There have been several good videos produced about this place. Number 2, the world's largest lake is in Russia. Extreme. Number 1, world's largest lake, the Caspian Sea. Okay, I've got 2 marks there. I've got the asterisk and I've got this thing there. Okay, to show that I need to explain a bit more. There might be a technicality or 2 here. Yes, so first of all, here's the Caspian Sea. Well, technically, by geographic terms, it is not actually a sea. It is a lake. That is, by technical geography terms, a sea is supposed to connect to the world's oceans. As you see clearly in the map here, the Caspian Sea does not do that. It does not connect to the world's oceans. The Mediterranean Sea goes through the Straits of Gibraltar into the Atlantic Ocean. The Black Sea connects to the Mediterranean Sea, which connects to the world's ocean. Yes, those are seas. They have that connection. The Caspian Sea does not. So technically, it's a lake. Second technicality is, well, how much of it now belongs to Russia? When it was the Soviet Union, it had more. So notice at the northwest side, we see Russia labeled there. But on the northeast side, it's Kazakhstan. On the southeast side, it's Turkmenistan. On the southwest side, it's Azerbaijan. and on the south side, it is Iran. So we have 5 countries that have claims to coastline and thus parts of the water of the Caspian Sea. When it was the Soviet Union, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Azerbaijan were all part of the Soviet Union. So it was the Soviet Union, and then Iran had its territory on the south side. But the Soviet Union had the majority, yes, around 80% of the shoreline and thus the water of the Caspian Sea. But that's long ago. The Soviet Union's gone. Now we have Russia, and you see Russia has about 20% of the shoreline and the water then of the Caspian Sea. So Russia has the Caspian Sea as the world's largest lake by surface area. Well, sort of. They have a piece of it. The Caspian Sea as a whole is the world's largest lake by surface area. To be, Russia does have the world's deepest lake, Lake Baikal. Lake Baikal, the jewel of Siberia and a point of often emotional attachment for Russians for their landscape. So here, arrow follows over to the city Irkutsk there and Lake Baikal, and you see the Lena River right there as well. Okay, so that's where we find Lake Baikal. Lake Baikal, a very beautiful location in the middle of Siberia, very large lake and the world's deepest and oldest lake. World's deepest lake because it happens to be wedged there between mountain ranges. To give you some comparison, my family lake cabin in Minnesota, the lake that we're on there is about 120 feet deep at its deepest spot. Okay, and that's not terribly deep. That's pretty common. A lot of lakes are like that. A lot of lakes are even more shallow than that, right? How about some of the big lakes of the world? Well, we're sitting on Lake Michigan here in Chicagoland. So Lake Michigan goes up to 923 feet deep. That seems pretty deep to me, but it's nothing compared to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in the world. It is the only lake in the world that is over a mile deep. Okay, so that's certainly an extreme measure that features a piece of the Russian landscape. All right, so 2 measures about lakes. Rivers, other bodies of water. Certainly if you have a very large land area, you're going to have some rivers that are traversing that area and that are going to be quite long as well. Now, rivers also typically have tributaries, smaller rivers or streams that flow into them. And sometimes those are counted as extending the river system. So for instance, in West Siberia, the big river is the Ob River. And you see the numbers here, 2,268 miles long. But if you take the also large river, the Irtysh, and add that, because it flows into the Ob, then we get 3,360 miles. And that combination is the number 7. It's the 7th longest river combination in the world. Take a look here. It is, you can see the Ob highlighted primarily and the Irtysh as one of the main tributaries. Okay, this is out in Western Siberia. In the north, you can see the Gulf of Ob there, a larger body, and a little bit of the Kara Sea, which is a feature of the Arctic Ocean. Next, as we move eastward from the Ob River, the next really big river is the Yenisei. You see the numbers there. And again, if we add a major tributary, it boosts this quite a bit. So the Yenisei-Angara Plus system is the 5th longest system in the world. On a similar map here, we see the Yenisei with several of the tributaries. The Angara, you see that approaching the Lake Baikal, and some of the other ones, including two that are referencing Tunguska, a Tunguska area. We'll come back to that. Okay, and note that the Yenisei flows quite near the city of Norilsk. There is a chapter in your textbook about Norilsk, a very significant location for natural resources in Russia. So here we have the Yenisei in the central portion of Siberia. Next, as we move eastward, it's the Lena. The Lena River generally is cited not as having tributaries helping to increase its length. It is the longest feature by itself. Comes out number 11 in the world there. Okay, and here is the Lena. Also, you can see that approaching Lake Baikal. The Lena Delta there on the Arctic Ocean is quite an elaborate feature in itself. There's some interesting satellite images you can find of that, for instance. Okay, so we're getting quite a bit eastward here in Siberia. Okay, the next one is the Amur River. And again, depends on whether we add tributaries or not. With tributaries, it is the 10th longest river system in the world. The Amur is complicated here because it is also partly the border between Russia and China. Okay, so some of these streams that connect to the Amur are coming from China. Some of the streams that connect to the Amur are coming from Russia. Now, if we look at these are the four big river systems of Siberia. If we look here at the Lena, if we look here at the Yenisei, if we look here at the Ob, we may realize, or maybe not, that these rivers flow to the north. These rivers flow to the north. Sometimes for Americans, that seems weird. Maybe that's because we're so accustomed to the Mississippi River cutting through the middle of our country, flowing from its origin in Minnesota down to New Orleans and emptying into the Gulf of Mexico, flowing southward, flowing to the south. Maybe an interesting study on the American psychology about how rivers flow, because sometimes Americans just assume that rivers flow to the south. That's true sometimes, but that is not the rule. The rule is rivers flow downhill. Well, if you think of that for a moment, of course that's true. Water flows downhill, wherever that is. It's true for rivers as well. Well, it turns out in Siberia, downhill is to the north. The Ob River flows northward because that's downhill. The Yenisei flows northward because that's downhill. The Lena flows northward because that's downhill. And that's why the Lena Delta there is on the Arctic Ocean. That's where the river reaches the ocean. The one that's different is the Amur. The Amur is flowing to the east and exiting there right next to the Sea of Okhotsk and part then of the Pacific Ocean. All right, but there is one other key river that we have to mention. It's not in Siberia, it's not as long as the others, but it's still quite prominent. And it's the key river of Western Russia, the key river where most of the people of Russia are, Western Russia. And so historically and currently, it's still quite important. And some consider it the mother river of Russia. Coming out at number 18. And the Volga here does actually flow to the south. Downhill is southward, and there near Astrakhan is where it reaches the Caspian Sea. Okay, notice that over here, the Volga is near Moscow, but does not reach Moscow. Oh, but faintly on the map, you might be able to see it, is a canal that connects the Volga to Moscow, which is advantageous for transportation and trade. Next, number 5 on my list, the tallest mountain in Europe. Okay, asterisk. Because how are we defining Europe? Well, we've done this. How are we defining the Russian domain? We've done this. I'm saying, this class is saying that the Russian domain is Russia plus Ukraine plus Belarus plus Armenia plus Georgia, maybe plus Moldova. And then that means Russia is not in Europe. But some people do it differently. So if you count the western part of Russia as being part of Europe, then asterisk, then Mount Elbrus is the highest mountain in Europe. It is in Russia. It is in the Kabardino-Balkarian Republic of Russia. It is near the country Georgia. Okay, if you count that part of Russia in Europe. We don't, but some people do. Okay, and there's a nice handsome picture of Mount Elbrus. Number 6, the world's largest section of continuous level land is the Western Siberian lowland. Siberia does have a range of landscapes, and we mentioned some mountain ranges out there, but Western Siberia is not at all. Western Siberia is this vast expanse of flat land. In fact, sometimes swampy land, the West Siberian lowland. So that western third or so of Siberia is this vast flat area. Here's a look at part of it with a river coming through and winding around, making a nice oxbow pattern there, that U-shaped pattern. Well, it is of note that this landscape makes it easy for flooding also. Very flat area, that helps for flooding, and the direction of river flow contributes here. So think about this. Think about the Ob River flowing to the north through Siberia. Well, what we see then is that the river freezes in the winter. Again, very cold place. So the river freezes in the winter. Then in the spring, the river thaws, but not bam, not 100% at the same moment. No, of course not. It thaws where it's warmest first. Where is it warmest first? In the southern parts of the river. So in springtime, the southern part of the river starts to warm up, thaws into just water, not ice, and flows north into ice. And so typically floods right there. More that southern areas tend to thaw out, warms up, water flows north into ice, often floods the banks. So you have a potential for flooding because of this ice pattern until the whole of the river does thaw. Flatlands, this pattern of freezing and thawing of the rivers contributes to a lot of flooding and a lot of swampy areas in the spring. Bonus is if you're an insect like a black fly or mosquito, this is great for breeding in these kind of swampy waters of the spring in West Siberia. Number 7, the world's largest section of coniferous forest. Well, remember there are 2 basic types of forest. There are deciduous trees, which are the broadleaf leaves, trees with leaves, right? And then there are coniferous forests. These are the trees that have needles, the pine tree, the evergreen tree, that kind of thing. And indeed, typically coniferous forests tend to be farther north, especially when you get forests that are dominantly coniferous trees. All right, so you see that shaded in on the map. A lot of Canada is like that. And vast sections of Siberia are like this. Or there we go. There's one location in Siberia. Not much to see except for largely these pine trees. Number 8, the world's largest section of permafrost. In this case, I have the asterisk there because Antarctica, maybe we count Antarctica here too, but I like this map showing areas of permafrost. We don't see a map like this usually because we don't tend to focus the map on the polar region, the North Polar region. So these are the far northerly areas taken from that vantage point. And the darker the shading, the more continuous the pattern of permafrost soils. Okay, so clearly a lot of Russia, northern Russia, and Siberia have these permafrost, often continuous permafrost soils. Well, permafrost soils are problematic. Permafrost soils can be frozen for a few feet down to many, many, many feet down. But what typically happens in the summer, yes, a short summer, but in the summer is that the top foot or so of permafrost may melt. Okay, the top foot or so may melt. And when that happens, you get a lot of muddy surfaces. Well, what may happen if you have built your house then on that surface? Well, probably you built it when it was nice, hard surface, frozen, and boom, your house looked good. But then summer came and the top foot or so melted, and now your house was on a foot of mud. Well, it may then shift a bit. And then winter comes back and it freezes up again. Then the next summer comes, and for a while you've got mud, and your house maybe shifts on the foundation again. And this can happen year after year. So this house is an example of that, of being built on permafrost soils and having shifted a bit over the years. You see the woman there is standing up straight and tall, but the house behind her clearly is leaning to the right. Well, this creates then hazards and complications for building infrastructure, homes, buildings, other features on permafrost soil. May require some additional engineering, some additional construction feats to get this done, or at least to get it done well. Also, Russia, especially from West Siberia, has lots of oil and natural gas and has extensive pipelines coming out of West Siberia, delivering oil and natural gas to western parts of Russia and even to Europe. You have to be careful with these pipelines also. If the pipelines just simply lie on the ground and the ground becomes muddy, the pipelines may shift and, worst case, break. And of course, you don't want oil or natural gas spilling out of a pipeline. So it takes extra engineering, often putting these pipelines up on pylons or some kind of risers with some flexibility, so that if the surface shifts a bit, the pipeline has enough flexibility and is off of the surface that it will still stay intact. Bad enough to have to build infrastructure, homes, buildings, factories in very cold places, but add the permafrost and you get often problems. There'll be a bit more permafrost talk coming up too. Because now the permafrost is melting. The permafrost is melting. And in your video worksheet on the Russian domain, I'll be asking you about this phenomenon. How is the permafrost melting and what are some of the consequences of that? Well, of course, this has to do with global warming and climate change. Number 9, remote islands. Yes, Russia, of course, does have islands. It has coastlines, so it has a number of islands. But most of these are, well, north of Russia in the Arctic Ocean. Just a very, very few would be Baltic or along the Black Sea, and some, yes, there are some noteworthy ones in the Pacific, such as Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands. But some of these are extremely remote, like a place called Novaya Zemlya, two very close together large islands north of the continental landmass of Russia. And during the Soviet Union, they considered this to be the ideal place for testing a really big nuclear weapon. It was called the Tsar bomb. Yes, the Tsar, named for their royalty, named for their emperor. Okay, even though this was after the monarchy was overthrown, yes, that's what they nicknamed this bomb. So here's another short video clip for you to watch, shorter than the previous one. So jot down this link and watch this link, please. Don't be troubled that the first 12 seconds of the visual part of the video, it's messed up for some reason. I don't know. But the sound is good, and then the video images come back to you. So take a look at this. Go. Hey, okay, you're back. So think about this. Why did they choose that place? Why did they choose that place to test a nuclear weapon? Well, what could be better than isolation for testing nuclear weapons? Well, both the United States and the Soviet Union tested nuclear weapons for a while above ground. Well, of course, this created some radioactive areas. So where would you want to do this? You'd want to do this in a very remote area, right? A remote island or perhaps a desert location where there are very few, if any, people living. And so both of these countries did some of that sort of thing before switching to underground testing. So where to test this largest bomb? Okay, well, this very far northern island, Novaya Zemlya, which simply means new land, new earth or new land, Novaya Zemlya. You saw it, and well, yeah, that makes some sense, right? To do this in a very isolated location. Speaking of isolated locations, number 10, the largest impact in recorded history was at Tunguska in 1908. When we're looking at rivers, in particular the Yenisei River, I mentioned that two of the river's tributaries used the word Tunguska. Yes, it was out in this very remote middle of Siberia area where something happened in 1908. Yes, there's some debate about what happened. It's probably a meteorite that approached the surface and blew up above the land here in the middle of Siberia. There's some who like the theory that it was an ice comet that did this, and that the little evidence of what was left behind meant that the comet had simply melted away in the explosion. There's some other interesting ideas here too. But something exploded here in a huge way above this very, very isolated place. Well, if you're testing a nuclear weapon, yeah, go ahead for a very isolated place. This wasn't a nuclear weapon test. This was something else, probably a meteorite. Well, is the same answer, I think. If you had to have a meteorite explode over the planet somewhere, I would prefer that it explode in a very isolated place. And it did there in Tunguska. So quite remarkable, I think. If this had to happen, a blessing that it happened in this very remote place. Again, in the video worksheet about the Russian domain, there's a bit for you to do with this. You'll be getting that. All right, so number 10, also about this huge place. And you know, if we look at the areas of the world where a meteorite could hit, of course, it could hit anywhere randomly. And a large section, roughly 70% of the world's surface, is water, oceans. So the most likely place for it to hit would have been the Pacific Ocean. But if it had to hit land, I guess the most likely place is Russia. Yes, because it is the world's largest country by land area. All right, and the Tunguska event was way out there. All right, then, so again, Russia is huge by area. Russia is big by population, and it's often extreme in terms of landscape features. And probably some of that could be just random because it is so big, it's likely to have some of the biggest or most extremes in landscape features. All right, so that's our plan for today's lecture, for today's presentation. Top 10 in Russia's landscape extremes. All right, bye-bye.